If you had to choose between honor and love, which would you choose? I ask, not out of idle curiosity, but because I've seen what that choice can do to a soul. I've watched it pull a woman apart like a prairie storm pulling boards off a roof. And sometimes, out there in the wide quiet of the West, you can hear the wind whisper her name, Mary. She lived up in that crooked little house on the hill, just outside the edge of town, where the road turned to dust and the dust turned to silence. Her chimney hadn't smoked in months. Her curtains never stirred. Some said she'd gone mad. Others said she was mourning. But nobody really asked, because nobody really cared to know. They just whispered, "She's the one who lost her man in the mine, ain't she? Widow by 25, what a curse." But what they didn't see, what only the land and the wind and the bones of that old house knew, was that Mary hadn't just lost a husband. She'd lost herself. When that mine caved in and swallowed her future whole, it didn't leave her with grief. It left her with emptiness. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just stopped. Stopped baking. Stopped tending the garden. Stopped singing while she stitched at night. She'd sit by the window some days, eyes fixed out across the barren plain, like she was waiting for something, or someone, but not him, not anymore. He was buried too deep for hope to reach. It was a brutal winter that year, the kind that made the horses limp and the whiskey freeze in the bottle. And it was on one of those nights, one of those bitter, bone-snapping nights, that everything changed. The wind had picked up. Snow whipped like knives across the empty porch. Mary had bolted the door, stacked the fire high, and curled herself into the threadbare chair her husband used to sit in. And then a thud, soft. Barely a sound, but enough to snap her eyes open. She waited. Silence. Then again, a creak, a groan. She reached for the rifle, not because she was scared, but because out here, if you weren't ready, you didn't last. She moved like smoke through the kitchen, down the back steps, boots crunching in the snow. The barn door was half open. That was wrong. She always latched it. She raised the rifle, stepped inside, and there, huddled in the hay, half frozen and bleeding from the side, was a man. Not just any man, a Comanche. His skin was dark with frost and dirt, his breath shallow like a dying animal. Blood soaked through his shirt. He didn't look at her, just stared at the wall, as if even death had grown tired of him. She could have shot him, should have, would have, if it had been last year, or maybe even last week. But something in her chest stopped her finger. Maybe it was the way he didn't flinch. Maybe it was the way the snow melted around his body, like even the cold didn't want to touch him anymore. Or maybe it was the first time in months she'd felt anything but numb. She lowered the gun, and that night, for the first time since her husband's death, the fire in her hearth burned late into the night. Not for warmth, but for a stranger, a wounded drifter, a hunted man, and something in Mary's soul began to stir from its long, cold sleep. Out here, love doesn't knock on the front door. Sometimes it bleeds into your barn and dares you to let it live. Would you have opened the door or locked it tighter? What would you do if everything you were taught said one thing, but your heart whispered another? That's what I keep coming back to. Out here, right and wrong aren't always clear. They blur like heat on a summer trail, shimmering, dancing, just out of reach. And sometimes, by the time you figure out what side you're on, it's already too late. Mary didn't sleep that night. She kept the rifle close, sitting in the corner of the barn with a lantern and a wool blanket draped over her shoulders. The man didn't move, just breathed slow, shallow. His face was stone, but his wound, just under the ribs, leaked through the shirt like rust through a wall. She didn't know what possessed her to help him. Maybe it was the look in his eyes, not pleading, not frightened, just resigned, like he'd already accepted that the world had no place left for him. That kind of silence does something to a person. It reflects back the parts of yourself you thought were buried. She found her old sewing kit. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from memory. The last time she'd threaded that needle, she was patching her husband's shirt, humming under her breath while he carved toy horses by the fire. And now, here she was, kneeling over another man, stitching flesh instead of fabric. She didn't ask his name, didn't need to. Names were for people who had a future. This man looked like he barely had a morning. She cleaned the wound, whispered prayers under her breath she didn't believe in anymore. He flinched once, just once, and then let her work in silence. His skin was hot with fever. His hands were calloused, scarred. She wondered what kind of life left marks like that. Not the kind they taught about in Sunday sermons, surely. When she finished, she sat back and studied him in the lantern glow. He was maybe 30, maybe less, maybe more. Time has a way of etching itself harder into some faces than others. His hair was thick, dark as night, braided in the old way. His lips were dry. She brought him water. He drank, slow and careful, without breaking her gaze. That look, it stayed with her. Not threatening, not soft, just present, like he saw her. Not just the woman in front of him, but her. The woman no one else bothered to see anymore. She left him there and returned to the house, but the walls felt different. Like the silence wasn't hers alone anymore. As if the wind outside carried a question she wasn't ready to answer. The next morning, she woke before the sun. She lit the stove, boiled coffee, took a slice of bread and a scrap of salted meat down to the barn. He was awake, sitting now, back against the stall wall, still watching. She set the food down and turned to leave. But he spoke, one word. "Thank you." His voice was low, rough, like dry leaves brushing the ground. It startled her more than the wound had. Maybe because it proved he was real, not a ghost or a dream. Flesh, blood, voice. Mary nodded, just once, then walked out without another word. That became their rhythm, silence, small gestures. Care passed like coin between strangers who weren't supposed to meet. Days blurred. The snow kept falling. She didn't ask why he was there or what he'd done. Maybe because deep down, she already knew. You don't end up half dead in a stranger's barn unless the world's given up on you. Or you've given up on it. But here's the thing they don't tell you about forbidden love. It doesn't start with kisses or touches. It starts in silence, in the quiet moments when two people see in each other the one thing they've never dared to hope for, understanding. And Mary was beginning to feel understood again. She caught herself humming one night, just under her breath, like the old days. It made her stop, mid-stitch. She felt her cheeks burn, as if caught doing something shameful. But no one was watching. No one ever was, except maybe him. That night, she sat by the window again, the moonlight painting the wooden floor in silver. And she thought, if I let him stay, what does that make me? A traitor? A sinner? A fool? Or a woman? Finally waking up from her grief. Maybe all of them. But sometimes Love asks for more than you're willing to give. Sometimes it asks you to betray everything you've known. Your town, your blood, your name. Would you say yes, or let it die quietly in the dark? If the world tells you something is wrong, but your soul says it's right, who do you listen to? I've wrestled with that question more times than I care to count. Out here, where the rules are as cold and sharp as the wind, there ain't much room for the heart. The heart makes mistakes. The heart forgives. And forgiveness, well, forgiveness gets people killed. Mary knew that. She knew it every time she stepped into that barn with hot stew in her hands and a lie already forming on her tongue in case someone ever asked what she was doing. But no one asked. No one came. The town had moved on from her. She was the ghost widow on the hill. Folks don't come calling on ghosts. The man, he never told her his name, and she never asked. Names made things real. Names made things dangerous. He healed slow but steady. The fever broke one night while she slept in the barn's hayloft, too tired to make the walk back home. She awoke to the sound of breathing that wasn't strained, saw him sitting up by the stall door, staring into the pale dawn like it was the first time he'd ever seen a sunrise. They spoke little. A few words here and there, enough to know he understood her, enough to let her feel safe, not because he was harmless. He wasn't. She could tell by the way he moved, quiet, watchful, always one hand near his belt knife even when he slept. No, it wasn't safety in his weakness, it was safety in their silence. They were both carrying something too heavy for words, and sometimes silence is the only language that doesn't lie. She caught herself noticing things. The way he always faced the door when he sat. How he winced when he reached for his side but never asked for help. How he never looked her in the eyes for long, like he didn't want to see what might grow there. But things did grow, like wildflowers in dry dirt, unspoken, uninvited, and unstoppable. One afternoon, she found him outside the barn, chopping firewood. Shirt off, skin marked with scars that told stories she'd never hear. He stood tall, solid, like a statue carved out of pain and patience. She wanted to look away. Knew she should, but she didn't. He saw her, their eyes locked, and neither of them moved. It lasted just seconds, but it rang louder than any bell. That night, she couldn't sleep, not because of fear, but because of heat. A heat that started somewhere deep in her chest and spread like wildfire, through every thought, every memory. Her husband had never made her feel like that. He was kind, yes, steady, but cold, like a man doing his duty, never daring to want more than the Lord allowed. Love had been something quiet, folded in linen and laid beside the bed. This was different. This was danger. And still, she lit a second lantern the next morning and hung it in the barn. A signal! He'd never thanked her again. Not with words. But when he handed her a small carved bird, whittled from one of the firewood logs, smooth and delicate, she understood. It was his name, spoken without letters. Trust, given without a bargain. But trust is a risky thing when the world's watching. And soon the world was watching. That week, riders came through town. Dust-covered, stone-faced men asking questions about a fugitive, a half-breed killer. Said he slit a soldier's throat and disappeared into the woods. Said he was dangerous. Said he'd come this way. Mary listened from the back of the general store, heart beating like a war drum. She didn't believe them, didn't want to. But still, the seed was planted. What if it was true? What if she'd opened her home and her heart, to a man whose hands were stained with more than just blood. She walked home in silence. The snow had started to melt. Mud clung to her boots. The barn door creaked when she opened it. He was inside, carving again. She looked at him, really looked. And for the first time she saw the man and the warning. She wanted to ask, wanted to scream, "Is it true?" But she didn't, because part of her was afraid to know, and another part already did. That night, as she lay awake, the question returned. If you had to choose between honor and love, which would you choose? She didn't have an answer, but her heart was already whispering one. Have you ever held something warm in your hands, knowing the world would call it wrong, but your soul refused to let it go? I remember that storm like it happened yesterday. The kind that creeps up from the canyon floor slow and quiet, until suddenly the sky cracks open and the wind howls like a wounded animal. Snow wasn't just falling, it was rising, whipped into swirls that erased the land itself. Mary had just come back from the creek, arms full of chopped wood and her bonnet soaked through. She'd told herself she wouldn't go to the barn that night, that she'd keep her distance, that she needed to think. But the storm had other plans. When the wind slammed the shutters and the smoke from the chimney blew sideways, she did what her instincts told her. She grabbed the lantern, and she ran. By the time she reached the barn, her dress was heavy with snow, and her boots filled with ice. She flung the door shut behind her, her breath fogging in the cold. He was there, already lighting a second lantern, already looking at her like he knew she'd come. Neither of them said a word. They just sat. In front of the fire pit he'd built with river stones and old tin, the flames danced between them. The barn creaked and groaned. Outside, the storm raged, but inside, it was quiet and warm. Too warm. She tried not to look at him, tried to focus on the fire, on the wood, on her own hands trembling in her lap. But he was looking at her. He always did, like she was something worth seeing. She cleared her throat, spoke first. "What did you do?" It was the question she'd held in her chest for days, the one that had burned holes in her sleep. He didn't answer right away. Then, soft, low, he said, "I ran." That's not what they're saying. He looked into the flames, and for a long moment she thought he might lie. But he didn't. "They killed my brother for crossing the wrong line. A soldier spit on his body. I put a knife in his throat." The barn didn't make a sound, just the pop of firewood, the wind hammering the walls. Mary felt her chest tighten, not with fear, but with something deeper, something heavier than judgment. She understood rage, understood what it meant to be pushed so far that nothing mattered but the scream buried in your ribs. She'd felt it when they dragged her husband's body out of the mine like a broken sack of flour. She'd felt it when the pastor told her it was God's will. She looked at him. His face was stone, not asking for forgiveness, not expecting it. "I'm not sorry," he said, "not for him, not for surviving." Mary nodded slowly. Then, with a voice that barely reached past the fire, she whispered, "Neither am I." And in that moment, two souls found each other in the ashes. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full, full of things they didn't say, couldn't say, didn't need to. She leaned forward. Her fingers brushed his just barely. He didn't pull away. The firelight danced across their skin like the last light of a dying sun. And in that warmth, they stopped being strangers. It wasn't lust, it wasn't passion. It was something older. Two people, carved by pain, finding a place where the world couldn't reach them. She fell asleep there, beside him, wrapped in a blanket he'd folded for her. Her head resting just near his shoulder, but not quite touching. Close enough to feel his breath, close enough to know she wasn't alone anymore. The storm raged on, but inside the barn there was peace. Not the kind that comes from safety, the kind that comes from surrender. And as the fire burned low, Mary dreamed, not of her old life, not of her dead husband or the house on the hill, but of a place far away, beyond maps, where rules didn't exist and love didn't ask for permission. When she woke, the wind had stopped, but the fire between them hadn't. If love means burning down the life you built, would you still choose it? There are some moments you can't unlive. Some choices once made sink into your bones like cold into the earth. And for Mary, that morning after the storm was one of them. She woke before the sun, before the frost had melted off the barn roof. Her head was still warm from sleep, her hand resting inches from his, the fire now just a bed of red coals. She didn't move, didn't want to, because the moment she did, it would become real. The silence between them had changed. It wasn't just comfort now, it was knowing. She'd chosen him without saying the words, but words would come soon enough, and with them, the world. It started with hoofbeats, distant at first, barely audible over the wind in the trees, but then closer, sharper, heavy boots crunching snow, voices shouting names, steel clinking, men with wanted posters and eyes that didn't blink. The posse had reached the edge of the hills, and they were asking about the Comanche drifter again. Mary watched them from the front porch, her hands steady, her breath slow. She'd seen death before, breathed it in, let it stain her sheets. But this was different. She went inside, closed every curtain, locked every latch, then walked to the barn like it was any other morning. But her eyes betrayed everything. He saw it the moment she opened the door. "They're coming," she whispered. He didn't ask who. He already knew. He rose without a word, started gathering his things, what little he had. The knife, the carved bird, the thin blanket, the quiet dignity of a man who'd lived his whole life ready to vanish. But then she did something he didn't expect. She stepped in front of him, and she said, "Don't go." He looked at her like she'd lost her mind. "They'll hang me, Mary. Not if we run." He paused, stared at her. "You'd leave everything?" She nodded, and in her eyes he saw it. Truth. Not some girlish fantasy, not some reckless whim, but the hardened decision of a woman who'd already buried a life once, and wasn't afraid to bury it again if it meant saving something that still had breath in it. "But why?" he asked, almost a whisper, and she said, "Because I'm more alive with you in this barn than I ever was in that house." He stared at her for a long moment, like he was searching for something inside her he'd stopped believing existed in people. And when he didn't find fear, only fire, he nodded. They packed nothing but a satchel. She took her dead husband's rifle. He wrapped the firebird carving in cloth and slipped it into her coat pocket without her seeing. The rest they left behind. Memories, burdens, names. By nightfall they were gone. The hills swallowed them. The cold bit at their skin, but they kept moving. Step after step. Silent. Together. Two shadows drifting into the land beyond fences, beyond laws, beyond judgment. That night, they made camp beneath an outcropping of rocks, the stars wide and watching. She sat with her knees drawn to her chest, eyes closed, breathing deep. He handed her a strip of dried meat. She didn't eat it, just held it. Like a question. "What now?" she asked. He looked up at the sky, then at her. Now we run until we find a place no one's looking. She nodded, but something in her tightened. Running meant never stopping. Running meant no home, no peace, just motion. But what is love if not a kind of holy surrender? A willingness to trade certainty for the beating heart of another. She looked at him again, this man with nothing. No land, no past. Just scars and silence and the fire in his eyes. And she knew this was the choice, not a wedding dress, not a vow under a church steeple, but this, a woman giving up everything for a love the world swore she shouldn't have, a man willing to be hunted, not for revenge, but for tenderness. Sometimes love isn't a sanctuary. Sometimes it's a battlefield you walk into willingly. And as the firelight flickered over their faces, she whispered, "I'm not going back." He didn't answer. He just took her hand and held it like something sacred. If you could vanish from the world to be with the one you love, would you do it, knowing no one would ever find you again? I've walked that question through snow and dust. I've laid it beside a campfire and heard it echo in my own bones. Because out here, on the edge of the known world, love doesn't bloom in gardens. It grows in the cracks between bullets and borders, between sacrifice and silence. They rode for days, no words, just the sound of hooves and heartbeats and wind cutting through the juniper trees. The land changed beneath them. Hills turned to cliffs, rivers to red stone. And then, one morning, just as the sky turned pale with the promise of dawn, they saw it, a canyon hidden behind a wall of brush and rock. No trail led to it. No path marked the way. It was as if the earth had kept its secret just for them. They descended slowly, cautious. The horses stumbled on the loose shale, but they didn't turn back. At the bottom, the canyon opened into a hollow wide and warm and filled with wild sage. A spring trickled through the rocks. The sun touched it first, before the rest of the world, like a blessing. And right then, they knew this would be home. Not forever, maybe. Nothing in the West ever was. But long enough to breathe. Long enough to stop running. They built a shelter from driftwood and tarp, cooked over a pit ringed with stones. She gathered herbs while he carved, quiet, steady, the way some men pray. At night, they lay beside each other, not touching, not needing to. The heat from their bodies said more than hands ever could. They weren't hiding anymore. They were living, on their terms, in their time. But peace has its price. Some nights, Mary would wake, heart pounding. Sure, she heard voices echoing through the canyon walls. Sure, they'd been found. She'd reach for the rifle before her eyes even opened. He'd rise, silent and barefoot, and check the ridge with eyes sharper than hers could ever be. And always, it was nothing, just wind, just ghosts. Still, the fear never fully left. That's the thing with love like theirs. It can grow wild and beautiful, but it never feels safe. Not when the world wants it dead. One evening, as the fire turned to embers, he gave her a bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside was a second carving, a woman, plain, strong. Her face bore lines she didn't yet have. Her hands held a bird. It was her. He'd carved her into the wood like a promise, like a prayer. No name, just the shape of her spirit. She didn't speak, didn't cry. She just held it and knew what it meant. He was saying he loved her in the only way he knew how, with his hands, with his quiet, with permanence. And yet, Mary felt the ache returning, a slow throb in her chest, the ache of something unfinished. Not regret, never regret, but the weight of absence. She'd left behind a life, a name, a place in a world that never really wanted her, but still, it had been hers. Now she had no past, only a man, a canyon, and a carved face in the palm of her hand. Is that enough, she asked herself? Can love replace everything else you leave behind? The answer didn't come, but she looked at him, sitting by the fire, his eyes half closed in peace, and she thought, maybe love doesn't replace what you lose. Maybe it just makes the losing bearable. They stayed there for a season, maybe two. No one knows for sure. Some say they moved on again, deeper into the wild, beyond the grasp of maps or men. Others say the canyon swallowed them like a secret, and their bones rest beneath the red stones, together. But I like to think they're still out there, not as ghosts, not as legends, but as something real, flesh and blood, fire and breath. Two people who chose love, even when it meant losing everything else. So I ask you again, if you had to choose between honor and love, which would you choose? Because Mary chose, and she never looked back.